in this episode.
And part of what object-oriented ontology, a new theory of everything, the book is about the idea that those options don't work. Naturalism doesn't really work. Social constructionism certainly doesn't work. But neither does this onto-taxonomy, where we say there's two kinds of things, human thoughts and everything else. All right. People aren't stupid when they believe in this. They're not saying that, oh, we're humans and therefore humans must be half the universe. No, their argument is better than that. Their argument is that we have somehow more direct access to the human than to anything else. And so, therefore, epistemologically at least, we have to start with the human because we first need to critique the equipment of human thought and its capability to access the world, basic Kantian ideal. I think that's mistaken. And I think we can see that's mistaken for a couple of reasons. Psychoanalysis has shown us one of the reasons, which is that we don't have direct access to ourself any more than to anything else. This is very powerful, especially in Lacan, an author who's become, it wasn't that important to me in my youth, but is becoming more important in the last few years, though I haven't written about him yet. His critique of Descartes is actually quite interesting. It's that in the I think, therefore I am, we're talking about two different I's. The I that thinks is not the I that am, and actually they're in conflict. The I that's thinking is the one that's executing the thoughts. The I that am, the I of the conclusion, is the one mediated by the symbolic order, and it's already not I that's thinking. And a similar critique was made of phenomenology way back in the 20s or 30s by one of my favorite authors, Jose Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher of that era, often called the more intelligible Heidegger. I was reading him same time I was discovering Heidegger. Wonderful writer, nearly won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And what he talks about there is the impossibility of self-reflexivity in phenomenology. That for Ortega, after studying Husserl in some detail, decided that we don't really have any possibility of direct access to ourselves, that it's always mediated. Why else would psychoanalysis exist if we have transparent self-access? And we often understand ourselves better through the feedback of others. This is one of the reasons, incidentally, that I tried to publish in lectures so much, is that I learn so much from feedback. I don't really learn when I'm brooding in my private chambers as much as I do when I'm putting stuff out there, getting positive and negative feedback, causing a bit of commotion, reading something in response to that, modifying it a bit. It's a kind of constant fine tuning in relation to the world that I like to do with my work. I find that essential. So I do those things whenever I can. Things like this podcast. I know you're going to ask me questions that make me think of things in new ways. So I think these are evidence of my commitment to the idea that the transcendent I is not something that can be purified of the world and then examined in all its splendor. There's always a gap between those two I's that we're trying to figure out. In any case, to get back to your main points, we don't really have any more direct access to the transcendental conditions of reality than we do to what it's like when one rock smacks into another, or when a volcano melts a house or something. In all of these cases, we have something interacting with another and not interacting fully with all of its reality, but only oversimplifying it, creating an oversimplified model of it and doing something to that model of it that then somehow may retroactively affect the real thing. So we have to reorient the terms of the fundamental issues in philosophy, I think. So that's one issue that feeds into object-oriented ontology, a new theory of everything.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the philosopher and metaphysician who led the development of object-oriented ontology, Professor Graham Harman. This was a far-ranging dialogue, and much like Professor Harman's philosophical nemesis, although in personal relations they're in very good terms, Slavoj Žižek, Professor Harman himself is also an excellent raconteur, and he really is good at bringing in personal anecdotes to elucidate more theoretical, dense philosophical points, and I thoroughly enjoyed this dialogue with him. I think if you're a student of contemporary Western philosophy, especially academically oriented philosophy, Professor Harman really doesn't need an introduction. You probably are aware of him. Either you agree or disagree with his views. He's one of those characters in philosophy. And as I did mention, yes, he is a central figure in the movement called speculative realism, and also the founder of Object-Oriented Ontology, which is a Weltanschauung, or to use the term he's used, really a new theory of everything that touches on archaeology, the natural sciences, narratology, literary theory, politics, and many other disciplines. And of course, one great pleasure in speaking to a thinker like Graham Harman is that he is such an eclectic thinker. He brings in all these different disciplines, and it makes sense given he is trying to develop a metaphysics out of OOO, or Object-Oriented Ontology. But if you aren't familiar with what OOO is, I highly recommend this short book. Despite Professor Harman being a so-called Continental philosopher, I don't really like the whole divide. He's a very clear writer, and he focuses on brevity. He gets his point across, uses many examples, again, like Zizek. And even for a neophyte like myself, I find his work extremely palatable and digestible. And yes, OOO is simply a theory that it's an object-centered metaphysics, which means ever since Kant, really a lot of metaphysics has been focused on it being subject-centered metaphysics. So we can't speak of reality in some sense without accounting for the subject. But OOO asserts that no, we can speak of object-object relations independent to the subject, and it develops on from there. Of course, that's a very almost, when you put it like that in a very formalistic sense, it really is meaningless. So you need to read the book and understand what he's getting at. However, hopefully this conversation does enlighten you in some way, even though it was a bit more, I wouldn't really call it an introductory dialogue to OOO. There are many other dialogues on the internet, public interviews, podcasts, and a lot of Professor Harman's public writing that you can find for that. This was a bit more where I discussed his work in particular. For instance, his views on Kant and the German idealists, and even the contemporary Hegelian philosophers like Todd McGovern, Adrian Johnston, and certainly we discussed the relationship between objects and time when discussing his book Objects Untimely, and even certainly a lot of Bruno Latour. You can never not talk about Bruno Latour when discussing or having a discussion with Professor Harman. However, before we continue, a quick PSA. You may be aware that I've mentioned multiple times I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. I simply don't have anything to sell you, and I deeply do believe that we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said though, forgive the tautology, we ultimately live in the world we live in, and I can't continue this project and sustain it if I don't have any kind of financial support. So as uncomfortable as this makes me feel, I sincerely would like to ask you to consider supporting this podcast financially. Needless to state, your listenership and viewership is more than enough support. However, if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. And if you're wondering what are the perks, what are you gonna get? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, because I'm not selling you anything. You're not buying anything, but rather, if this podcast, if the work I've done has brought you any kind of value, if you've learned something new, do consider supporting me on these platforms, but to reiterate, only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. So yes, as I was saying, if you learned something, if you found any value in this work I do consider supporting my work financially. Hopefully this conversation would be an example of me demonstrating, even though I don't want to kind of make it a performative thing, that I do try my best to research deeply before these interviews and podcasts, primarily out of respect for the guests, but at the same time because I'm interested in these topics, and hopefully, given you're watching this or listening to this, you are too. Be that as it may, now a quick formal introduction to Professor Harman. Professor Graham Harman is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. He was also a professor at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and Professor of Philosophy at the European Graduate School. Professor Harman is one of a handful of contemporary philosophers, and I should emphasize, a bona fide metaphysician who are constructing the position called speculative realism, and his specific position centers on object-oriented ontology. Professor Harman has authored numerous books such as Object-Oriented Ontology, A New Theory of Everything, Objects Untimely, Object-Oriented Philosophy and Archaeology, and Architecture and Objects. With that being said, here's my conversation with Professor Graham Harman.
Yes, Professor. I was thinking where to start. Obviously, you're a extensive writer and thinker. And look, I don't want to kind of belabor you with, making you explain the concept of object-oriented ontology because you've done it in multiple interviews, multiple podcasts, and written extensively. So we really don't have to do that. And I think most listeners, if they click on this, they probably already are somewhat familiar with the concept. But perhaps to make things a bit interesting, let's start on a bit of a biographical note. I know your first book was Tool Being. I haven't read it, but I've listened to a couple of lectures and talks on it. So you kind of started off really as an Heideggerian. And I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about your development as a thinker and how you, became a kind of a speculative realist or an object-oriented ontologist, uh, whereas you started off more as a Heideggerian.
Right. Funny story with Heidegger. I think I first heard his name as part of the Monty Python Philosophers song years ago, high school. And so his name stuck into my mind from that. And then I grew up in Iowa, which is a rural state in Midwestern America. And a common thing to do there in the summer is agricultural labor, picking the tassels out of corn. And it's not a lot of money, but it's a lot of money for a high school student to get it once. And so I walked into a bookstore and bought a copy of Being in Time. And it helped that I had some high school German, so I understood some of the German and brackets and the text and things like that. But it took me about 3 tries to get through it. And I actually got through another book of Heidegger's first, The Metaphysical Foundations of Logic. But anyway, Heidegger became the central philosopher for me at about 19 or 20. And my doctoral work was on him. My doctoral work became the book Tool Being. And I spent most of my 20s reading what then existed as the Heidegger Gesamtausgabe, improving my German in the meantime to do so. And so that early stage of my career, I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to be a professional Heidegger scholar. But it wasn't long before I realized that I just wasn't a good fit for that group. Like scholars of any other figure, they are largely focused on trying to get Heidegger's self-conception right. Whereas I was more interested in getting the ideas right and seeing where the ideas lead us rather than in what Heidegger intended to do with them. And so this led to me pushing Heidegger's tool analysis in a way that most Heideggerians in the mainstream sense don't find plausible. But it led me to some very interesting thoughts and to a philosophy of my own ultimately. But Tool Being was my dissertation. I did go through and rewrite every sentence, and I added a few sections, the one on Hubert Dreyfus and the one on Zizek. Those were added at the time of after the dissertation. But it's otherwise substantively the same text, except that I rewrote it.
So would you say even at the time when you originally wrote it, you still the notions you outlined, let's say in object-oriented ontology, that those ideas were still, at least you were intimating at those ideas that they were more like concrete ideas, or were you still very much there in the kind of sort of in their nascent form, so to speak, and you were developing them? And as in, what I'm trying to say here is there a time where you kind of became Graham Harman, as we know, as an object-oriented ontologist right now? Because, with philosophers, like if you take someone like Wittgenstein, you have the early Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein, and so on. And I'm curious whether you always had this idea about giving objects their own ontological place.
There's a prehistory to that, but the author people know today is from Christmas Day, 1997, a very dramatic moment when I was invited to there was an all-day Christmas party at my fellow graduate student's house, and I was a no-show until night. And he finally called me and said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I'm puzzling over a really interesting idea." And that was simply the idea that the withdrawal of being behind the appearance of a thing, which for Heidegger is central to Dasein, that this is actually probably constitutive of all interactions between any two things whatsoever. That two inanimate stones having a causal interaction also do not fully interact with each other, and that the human inability to grasp the real is simply a special case of that. And that was Christmas 1997 was the day that really became something I deeply believed and have acted on ever since. That's when it became the really realist object-oriented ontology. And that didn't come from nowhere, of course. It's a prehistory. The immediate prehistory of that is that I spent the summer of 97 reading two authors very closely, and one of them was Alfred North Whitehead, for whom also it is the case that perceptual immediacy, as he calls it, is just a special case of causal interaction. It's not the case, as it is for Kant, that finitude is this uniquely human burden that we must carry. It's simply a byproduct of relations. Relations do not exhaust their terms. There's always a surplus in the things that interact in any relation. And that, simple as it sounds, that has been more or less off limits for philosophers since Kant. We'll get into that a little later, I think, because you have some very interesting questions you plan to ask about philosophy's relation to science and so forth. But I'll just say that that's the part of my philosophy that mainstream continental philosophers, let's say, are completely unwilling to accept. The idea that any relation between any two terms needs to be handled the same way. For continental philosophy, and in some sense, much of analytic philosophy, the human world relation is the key given through which everything else is filtered. Because since we're human, we're supposedly having direct access to the human world, the thought world relation, in a way that we don't have access to a raindrop car roof relation. I think that's a mistake, but that's the prejudice Tripolo is dealing with here. The idea that the human relation to the world is somehow an immediate given in a way that nothing else is.
All right, Professor. So just to, I guess, some naive questions here. If we could, let's say, steelman the opponent here for a moment, when you mean the human relation to the world, so the subject's relation to the world is in its immediate given, and then I guess how does that differ from what you would just call an object-object relation? So why do you think, let's say, post-Kantian philosophy, both in Continental and analytic, they give it more salience to this subject-object relation over the object-object relation in reality?
One of the pieces of fallouts of Kant's revolution in philosophy, and it was a revolution, even before we talk about the idea of the thought world relation as being primary, we need to talk about the assumption that people think science basically gets inanimate objects right. And there's nothing philosophy can really add to the study of non-human objects that science isn't already doing better. And of course, this is a byproduct, obviously, of the fantastic success of the sciences over the last 400 years. The increasingly amazing insights the sciences give us into various remote and near subjects. And none of that is something I will challenge. But it also needs to be remembered that no less a figure than Bertrand Russell made the claim in the analysis of matter that science gives us the extrinsic and relational properties of things, not their intrinsic properties. And okay, what does that mean? We can debate what that means. But one of the things that it means is that science does not exhaust the discussion of the inanimate worlds. There are philosophical ways to talk about the inanimate worlds. Some people are bothered by this because some people are committed to this division of labor in which the sciences deal with the non-human world and humans somehow deal with the transcendental structure that enables our access to the world. That's, let's say, 80, 85, 90% of present-day philosophy is structured around that assumption. The exceptions, obviously, are naturalism, which thinks science should have the last word on everything, including consciousness, and therefore on the transcendental structure. And the other is the opposite, less powerful one, social constructionism, which is that science has to be viewed as a social power play, and therefore sociology has the upper hand. But those are the two terms that people argue over: thought and world, culture and nature, human and non-human. Those are the poles around which everything revolves. And we're going to talk about Merleau-Ponty and Schelling in a bit, or should I dive into that first right away?
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah, I mean, you said thought in the world. I mean, I know in the essay, the article, the only exit from modern philosophy, you call it the Onto-taxonomy, which you say we need to.
Yes.
It's a false taxonomy. But yes, please go ahead to Schelling and Merleau-Ponty. Yeah, absolutely.
Onto-taxonomy, that's a word I think I introduced in my book on Dante. And Nicky Young, my colleague in Malta, was the one who urged me to use this term more often, that he found the term succeeds in getting things across to people in his lectures. And so I've written a little more about it. I wrote more about it in that article. Onto-taxonomy is the idea that it's the job of ontology to start by distinguishing between different kinds of things. So we start, for instance, with, there are basically two kinds of things in the world: human thoughts and everything else, for modern philosophy. And people accept that. The debate is simply over whether we should reduce all of them to the thought pole, like idealists and social constructionists, or whether we should reduce it to the everything else pole, like naturalists, scientific thinkers, people who think that science should have the last word on everything, and its philosophy is little more than a rough draft of things that are done better by science later on. Someone like Daniel Dennett, that's his approach, for instance, the late Daniel Dennett. And part of what Object-Oriented Ontology, a new theory of everything, the book is about the idea that those options don't work. Naturalism doesn't really work. Social constructionism certainly doesn't work. But neither does this onto-taxonomy, where we say there's two kinds of things: human thoughts and everything else. All right. People aren't stupid when they believe in this. They're not saying that, oh, we're humans and therefore humans must be half the universe. No, their argument is better than that. Their argument is that we have somehow more direct access to the human than to anything else. And so therefore, epistemologically at least, we have to start with the human, because we first need to critique the equipment of human thought and its capability to access the world, basic Kantian ideal. I think that's mistaken. And I think we can see that's mistaken for a couple of reasons. Psychoanalysis has shown us one of the reasons, which is that we don't have direct access to ourself any more than to anything else. This is very powerful, especially in Lacan, an author who's become, it wasn't that important to me in my youth, but is becoming more important in the last few years, though I haven't written about him yet. His critique of Descartes is actually quite interesting. It's that in the I think, therefore I am, we're talking about two different I's. The I that thinks is not the I that am, and actually they're in conflict. The I that's thinking is the one that's executing the thoughts. The I that am, the I of the conclusion, is the one mediated by the symbolic order, and it's already not I that's thinking. And a similar critique was made of phenomenology way back in the 20s or 30s by one of my favorite authors, Jose Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher of that era, often called the more intelligible Heidegger. I was reading him the same time I was discovering Heidegger. Wonderful writer, nearly won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And what he talks about there is the impossibility of self-reflexivity in phenomenology. That for Ortega, after studying Husserl in some detail, decided that we don't really have any possibility of direct access to ourselves, that it's always mediated. Why else would psychoanalysis exist if we have transparent self-access? And we often understand ourselves better through the feedback of others. This is one of the reasons, incidentally, that I tried to publish and lecture so much, is that I learn so much from feedback. I don't really learn when I'm brooding in my private chambers as much as I do when I'm putting stuff out there, getting positive and negative feedback, causing a bit of commotion, reading something in response to that, modifying it a bit. It's a kind of constant fine-tuning in relation to the world that I like to do with my work. I find that essential. So I do those things whenever I can. Things like this podcast. I know you're going to ask me questions that make me think of things in new ways. So I think these are evidence of my commitment to the idea that the transcendent I is not something that can be purified of the world and then examined in all its splendor. There's always a gap. between those two eyes that we're trying to figure out. In any case, to get back to your main points, we don't really have any more direct access to the transcendental conditions of reality than we do to what it's like when one rock smacks into another, or when a volcano melts a house or something. In all of these cases, we have something interacting with another and not interacting fully with all of its reality, but only oversimplifying it, creating an oversimplified model of it, and doing something to that model of it that then somehow may retroactively affect the real thing. So we have to reorient the terms of the fundamental issues in philosophy, I think. So that's one issue that feeds into object-oriented ontology, a new theory of everything. Another thing feeding into that is that, as I said in the book, there's a smallest prejudice in physics. So I want to say, before I start dumping on theories of everything in physics, I love them. In fact, you could say that all of object-oriented ontology was initially triggered by a wonderful article I read in high school about the electroweak unification. Once in a while, I go back and find this article and read it again. I think it may have been Harper's, and it was back in the mid-'80s, and it was about Weinberg and Glashow and Abdus Salam and their joint formulation of the electroweak theory through different paths. And I just love the fact that there were these different forces in the world that they were unifying. And this is what physics, of course, tries to do. It has notoriously failed in the case of quantum theory and general relativity. We've been talking about this in my core class the last few days. But I liked thinking of philosophy as doing something like that, rather than just doing these nail-filing clarifications of the transcendental conditions of human access to the world, whether through consciousness or language or speech. So I always had a kind of physics outlook in that sense on philosophy. I just didn't think that meant reducing all of reality to subatomic particles, because things also emerge at larger levels. And I wouldn't have been able to be this articulate about it at age 17 as I am now. You learn these things through years of struggle and years of failure to articulate things properly, and years of frequent rejections. But emergent things happen at higher levels. And so you could say that the workings of the Los Angeles Police Department are reducible to the motions of quarks and electrons. But not only is that impractical, it's strictly speaking wrong, because you can remove any number of quarks and electrons from the Los Angeles Police Department. You can remove any number of individual officers and even chiefs. And yet a culture can persist over time that's hard to change. There are larger structures that last. And so the smallest thing isn't going to find you reality. The physical thing, the physical underpinnings of things, isn't always going to find you the reality. Not just because we don't have good enough computers to predict the future as Laplace wanted by knowing the position of all the atoms, but because even if there were no quantum effects and we could know the exact location of all atoms, stuff would still happen at the higher levels that is completely unpredictable at the level of the smaller stuff, because larger wholes insulate themselves from certain effects at the smaller level. And actually, somebody who writes very well about this in a non-philosophical context is Stephen Jay Gould in his last big book, Structure of Evolutionary Theory, where he's talking about his hierarchical model of evolution. He talks about 5 different scales specifically, and talks about how actually what each scale does very well is control the level below it. Cancer, for instance, being a failure of that. The organism wants to control cellular mutations for its own stability, and cancer is simply one of those cases where it can no longer do so, and so the lower level triumphs over the higher level. But effectively, for a new level to function, it needs to not just be emergent beyond what came before it, it also needs to retroactively shape what's beneath it for its own benefit, its own stability. And so the higher levels of causation do a lot more work than I think classical physical theories of everything are aware of, or at least thematize. And then another theme, of course, as you know, that I bring up early in the book is literalism. Ultimately, my enemy is literalism. Literalism, in short, is the idea that a correct prose statement of the world is essentially interchangeable with the world.
Yeah, here's where you're somewhat critical of even analytic philosophy, certain a strand of analytic philosophy, right?
Yes. Analytic philosophy is very much a literalist enterprise. It bases itself on the natural sciences. That has its upside. Analytic philosophy is good at avoiding bullshit. It's good at defining problems with precision, examining all of the available options rather precisely and rigorously, and then whittling down the possibilities through arguments, and they never quite reach agreement. No philosophers do. So there are a lot of things I like about analytic philosophy. The problems with it, first of all, I think it's an overly aggressive culture in many ways. I've not enjoyed the analytic philosophy settings in which I've been around. Because I think part of that's because there's a tendency in analytic philosophy to assume that if something can't be stated clearly in English prose, then it's not worth talking about. And that may be a useful criterion for filtering out nonsense, but the fact is it often takes years to learn how to put one of our ideas into adequate English prose. And by then, the real action has moved on. Thoughts do come in intuitions, in the form of intuitions. Thoughts do come in the form of a vague sense that something's not quite right with the established possibilities. And I found that the real philosophers tend to be people who struggle at the beginning with language, and not the people who easily think in words. The people who easily think in words, I think, are often people who like to imagine themselves winning arguments and like winning arguments. And I think there are too many of that kind of person in analytic philosophy. I really do. And again, I'm one of the biggest of Continental critics out there. So I don't think Continental philosophy is any paradise. I think it turns too easily into a kind of high school French and German club where people simply pump their favorite European thinkers and defer to anybody with a French or German accent, and are overly impressed by people who cannot state their arguments in words, and overly impressed by pseudo-literary gesticulations that don't amount to much more than mannerisms. So I'm going to give plenty of it to Continental philosophy as well. But to get back to my main point, literalism, what's the problem with literalism? Well, I end up defining literalism as equivalent to the view that an object is nothing more than the sum of all the qualities it possesses, which, of course, is David Hume's idea. And David Hume is a crucial figure in the genesis of analytic philosophy, maybe the most important figure in some ways. And Hume is great, of course. He's appreciated more by analytics than Continentals in many ways. But in no way can you say that an object is simply a sum of qualities, a bundle of qualities. And I think part of why this is true is shown by phenomenology. I think the key insight of Edmund Husserl is the idea of adumbrations, the idea that an object can manifest many different qualities at many different times, and yet it still remains the same object. And you say, well, what are the criteria for this? Well, the fact is, we're in the realm of human intentionality here, so I am the criterion. I recognize this is the same orange. That's the same orange. It looks a little different. It's a little more shadowy now than it was an hour ago. People who try to counter that, like I've seen Thomas Metzinger do this. I've seen Daniel Dennett do it. I think many others do it. They'll say, yes, but you can be wrong about that, just like you're wrong about your sense of the temperature in the room. You really need to measure it with a thermometer. Okay, but all that really proves is that there's a possible discrepancy between the temperature I feel in the room and what the thermometer says. You can't just assume that the thermometer gives the true temperature of the room and that my sense of the temperature of the room is merely subjective. Heidegger made a whole bale of hay out of attacking that, right? The idea that even though your glasses are closer to your face than I am, sitting thousands of miles away, in some sense, I'm closer to you than your glasses because you're not noticing them. And you can't say, well, technically that's false because a meter stick will show that your glasses are far. Okay, yes, but you're missing something important. If you assume that's objective scientific instruments give us the reality.
Is it another example if Daniel Dennett makes is the taste of wine where he says, the real taste isn't what you experience, but it's the pH level or whatever the mathematical abstraction is.
And then he makes fun of the wine taster saying a flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina. And he kind of treats that as obviously ridiculous and says you should just be able to pour the wine in a machine and get the chemical formula. And that's part of his attack on qualia more generally. Well, again, he is assuming that the chemical formula of the wine is telling us the true flavor of the wine, and that the flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina, is somehow mere subjective shading. And so that the only function of the human mind is to paint this level of error on top of an objective scientific worldview, and that over time we'll all realize that we should really be speaking about the chemical formula. Okay, that assumes that literalism is true. That assumes that a wine is nothing more than a combination of chemicals. Of course, what happens is that things happen at a certain level. Flavors of wine don't really exist except for an animal palate, first of all. At the chemical level, strictly, there is no flavor. There are certain chemical combinations that will predictably give rise to certain flavors when touching animal tongues and when smelled by animal noses. Smell is also a part of the flavor, of course. You shouldn't just assume that one of those is more real than the other. And in fact, since for me it's an important principle that objects are not bundles of qualities, that objects are in tension with their qualities, constant tension with their qualities. It's always negotiable what qualities a thing can lose and still be the same thing or not. And we find many examples of this in the arts. And I realize that analytic philosophy prefers the science as a model to the arts. And I realize that science provides a kind of automatic precision that you don't get from the arts. And yet we should also consider that aesthetic sensations often run much deeper than theoretical understandings, and that even the greatest theoretical understandings often have an aesthetic component. You have Georg Cantor saying, "I see it, but I can't believe it," about his discovery of transfinite numbers. You have Einstein bragging about the beauty of the equations for general relativity. You have Crick and Watson saying the double helix structure is too beautiful not to be true. And yes, I'm reading Sabina Hossenfelder's attack on the infestation of science by beauty right now, but there's something to this link between aesthetics and powerful cognitive breakthrough. For me, what aesthetics is about is not just a pretty painting that gives us emotions and therefore should be eliminated in favor of some cognitive science description of what's going on. It's about the aesthetic phenomenon driving a wedge between the object and its qualities in a way that literal experience does not. And there are a couple of ways to make this clear to your listeners. One of the things I like to say about metaphor that makes it differ from literal language is literal language is reversible and metaphor is not. So if you say a pen is like a pencil, it makes no difference if you say instead a pencil is like a pen. It's the same comparison. In both cases, you're judging. Are they similar enough? Well, yeah, sure. They're both long and skinny and cheap, and they write in a dark thing on a white medium, leaving dark traces on a white medium paper. You cannot do that with a metaphor. When Homer says the wine dark sea in the Odyssey, you can also say the sea dark wine, but that's no longer the same metaphor. Why is that? I asked myself that at one point, and the reason is obviously that in a metaphorical statement, the terms are asymmetrical. One of them plays the object role, the other plays the qualities role. So in the case of wine dark sea, you have a sea with wine qualities. In the case of sea dark wine, you have a wine with sea qualities. And that's where the differences begin. Now, of course, aesthetic precision, as admitted, is never going to be as precise as prose literal language. But that does not mean that literal prose language is the gold standard for all human cognition. For the last 400 years, we've gotten used to literal descriptions and scientific descriptions in particular as being the final word on truth. I think more people are starting to see now that truth takes many manifestations and not all of them can be expressed in that way. Bruno Latour, in his late work, for instance, made the very interesting point, but he was also trying to fight the monopoly on truth of two modern discourses, not only science, but also economics in the human sphere. Those have become the master discourses for everything, science and economics. And everything else has been viewed as kind of fuzzy poetry by comparison. Well, Latour starts noticing some others. So let's start with the one that most people will agree with, law. I think people are fine with the idea that scientific truth does not have the last word in law. A judge can exclude pieces of scientific evidence if they were obtained illegally, if they will unfairly prejudice the defendants, if the prosecution missed the deadline for submitting them. All of these things can rule certain undeniable scientific evidence out of court, because law has a different mode of truth. Law is able to exclude certain things from the sphere of its truths. Law also does things, as Latour noted, like it takes certain things to be true, namely, if neither party disputes them. It simply takes them to be true. And there are other examples like that in law. And under the American law, I'm not sure how it works in Australia, we often even have plurality within the mode of law, in the sense that O.J. Simpson, our celebrity football player, who was accused of a infamous double murder here in Los Angeles in 1994, was acquitted of the murder, but later found liable in the civil trial for financial damages for the same killings, wrongful death. And I know at least one European philosopher, a prominent European philosopher, who was appalled by this. How could this happen? Because in his country, this is not possible. Well, it's possible under the American legal system because there are differing burdens of proof in criminal and civil trials. The criminal trial, the prosecution must prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And in the civil trial, it's simply the weight of the evidence, preponderance of the evidence. So in the civil trial, you simply had to be 51% convinced that OJ was the killer, and you would award the money. It's possible, though this seems not to be true, that all 12 of OJ Simpson's criminal jurors thought it very likely that he was the murderer, but couldn't pass the point of reasonable doubts, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so therefore they had no choice but to acquit him in their own eyes. My brother's wife was on a murder trial here in Portland, Oregon. And I was just hearing this story recently. It was a case where a man was on trial for murdering his wife with a gunshot to the head. His story was that it was a suicide pact gone wrong, and that she had shot herself and he had shot himself and failed to kill himself. That was his defense. And part of the prosecution's case was there's no way a woman as small as her could have held the gun at that length and managed to shoot herself. And so the jury during deliberations asked the judge for the gun. The judge sent them the gun. Turns out my brother's wife was closest to the size of the deceased woman. And so she's the one who had to hold the gun up against her own head, and found that she could very easily have shot herself that way. And they ended up acquitting the man simply because they couldn't get beyond a reasonable doubt. He might well have shot his wife, but they had to let the guy off because that's the standard in American criminal trials. Anyway, law is one example. Politics is another that people are less willing to accept. You still hear people say that, oh, politicians should stop being so corrupt and irrational and just use the facts to solve their problems. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the physicist, said that on Twitter a few years ago. He said the world needs a country called rationalia with a one-line constitution. All problems will be settled by the weight of evidence. And immediately, I can think of dozens of political problems where that's not going to work because there are disputes about the evidence. Sometimes the evidence itself is a political question. So the one I know best from having lived in Egypt is the dispute over Nile water rights between Egypt and its neighbors on the Nile. And if you dig into the case, you'll see that every party to the conflict has a case. And there's not going to be any simple way for a judge or for a priest, for that matter, to simply say who's right. Probably force is going to be part of the picture that settles who's right, because governments of a country have an obligation to defend their nation's interests. And sometimes you disagree with your neighbor, and then your neighbor is trying to threaten a vital national interest. You take the matter into your own hands because that's your job. And so I'm not sure that war and conflict are things that can be scientifically cleansed away. That's another example. Latour's third example is much more controversial, and that's religion. Much more controversial simply because plenty of scientifically minded people are willing to say religion's just a fantasy, it deserves no weight at all in such debates. So you have to kind of build your way to that case if you're going to argue that religion deserves any weight. But the major point being that there are a number of different modes of veridiction. There are a number of different ways we decide what is true or not true. And not all of them involve scientific evidence. I just finished teaching a whole semester on conspiracy theories. And the problem there is that a lot of times conspiracy theories themselves sciences themselves are included in the conspiracy theories. And another problem, of course, is that most of us will mock most conspiracy theories and say how ridiculous, but our ultimate basis is the authority of science, and most of us are not working directly in science. And so really we are trusting the social institution of science and assuming that these people are telling us that. I'd rather trust that than trust Trump supporters at a bowling alley wearing their red hats. But there's still an epistemic problem there. The book that we used for class kept making the point that the way to solve conspiracy theories is to go to an epistemic authority, a valid epistemic authority. But the valid epistemic authority is quite often what's in dispute in the conspiracy theory. And most of us don't believe in most of these theories, but many of us believe in at least one. I'm inclined to believe the Kennedy assassination conspiracy myself, for two reasons. One is that the killing of Oswald 2 days later seems too suspicious to me, and second, so many people hearing shots from the grassy knoll makes me think there had to be another shooter. But in terms of the official report, I'm a conspiracy theorist. It simply happens to be one of those areas where the conspiracy theorists are over 40% of the population. And that seems to be the threshold from my studies this semester. That seems to be about the threshold for a theory to be pretty mainstream. If you get over 40%, sizable enough people believe the conspiracy theory that it needs to be taken seriously and not just mocked. If you get down into the 30s, at least in the United States, what happens is you get partisan conspiracy theories. So yes, 36% of Americans will still claim that Barack Obama was not a really a citizen, but they're all Republicans, more or less. So I write that off as partisan wish fulfillment, right? That's wishful thinking. And then when you get down, you have to get down in like 6% and below to get to the crazies like the lizard people theory and QAnon. And my wife and I actually met a woman wearing a tinfoil hat for the first time earlier this year. Yeah, it was a woman walking towards us on the beach in Los Angeles wearing a very interesting ethnic looking hat. We were trying to guess where it was from. She came up close to us and my wife said, "Oh, nice hat." And she took it off and said, "Thanks." And it was all lined with tinfoil. And she immediately pointed up at the airplanes and said, "You need to put this in your hats because they're reading your thoughts." And I'd never actually met someone like that before.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, it feels like straight out of a movie.
It is. But then ultimately, what leg do I have to stand on in looking down on her? I guess simply that I've received a normal basic science education, and I've never heard of such a thing as airplanes being able to control people's thoughts. And yet I have heard of crazy people believing in tinfoil hats. And so ultimately, I'm not really in a great epistemic position to put her down. And so there needs to be some more discussion of how exactly we go to verify our beliefs with third parties and so forth. And especially at a time like this, when science as an institution is no longer uniformly trusted by the public, at least not in this country, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in many ways, my dad used to joke around that when America catches a cold, or when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. So it's flowing on even here in Australia. I remember during COVID, the anti-vax stuff was blowing up because of what was going on, mostly through propagandists in US media. So it's interesting how, how all of that comes together. But Professor, it's really interesting. You mentioned, you've been reading Lacan more deeply, and as you know, his whole kind of Lacanian aphorism, "There is no big other." And I think that really is becoming a bit more palpable when we even, for the longest time, our big other was science and perhaps even capitalism to a certain extent, and I think now really that big, you could see that whole notion of the big other itself is castrated, let's say, so to speak. Yeah, brilliant. That makes a lot of sense, Professor. I mean, look, there's in the interest of time, I'm probably going to move on to some of the more meaty theoretical topics.
Mhm.
I think, yeah, of course, as you did rightly point out, Kant is someone I really want to discuss with you. However, before that, I just want to ask a very almost like naive, these like basic philosophical questions regarding human freedom and what your views on that are. So I wrote down this question because I had to articulate it. So let me first see if I could. When I was listening to your discussions with some Hegelian philosophers like Todd McGovern, Zizek. And I know you said that your memory is a bit fuzzy because you know had it was a while back. And I completely understand that this notion, and perhaps I even resonate with it, even though I still am somewhat, I'm still, let's say, corrupted by Kant. I'm still somewhat of a subject-oriented ontologist. It's very hard for me to leave the Kantian paradigm in some sense. But I get what you're trying to say here that, yeah, I mean, without a doubt, especially you outline in this book very clearly that philosophy has to be able to speak of objects independent of the subject. I mean, if not, it just becomes like this, almost like it's like a it just inexhaustible topic. After a certain point, we have to speak of other things other than the transcendental I and whatnot that the German idealists love talking about. But anyway, sorry, I'm being long-winded here. So, uh, from the discussions, here's what I figured. You said that if you're saying the subject-object relationship is just a special object-object relationship, doesn't that mean the subject functions and that the subject functions as an object? But then doesn't that mean that you can't define the subject the same way you define an object, in the sense that, yes, I know you mentioned that objects themselves have a surplus, but isn't the surplus that a subject have in reality, isn't that ontologically different to the surplus that an object would have? As in, why? My question in plain language would be, how is a relationship between uh, two objects the same as a relationship between a subject and an object? Because for me, it seems that this surplus for a subject it's different. It's to what you would expect between two objects. And then maybe the addendum to that would be, can you just comment on this question of human freedom? How do you understand freedom in the universe or reality of through the lens of object-oriented ontology? Yeah, I know that was a lot there, but if that makes sense.
Right. I'll start with the freedom part. I think the question of human freedom needs to be rethought. I think what happens now is human freedom is declared by fiat because humans are ontologically special. They're so uniquely different from everything else in the cosmos that freedom must necessarily follow, because we are able to extract ourselves from the causal chain in ways that other objects are not. And of course, Kant has the problem that in some ways we're not at all extracted from the causal chain, and there's this duality. But quite aside from that, I think there's room to come up with a much more nuanced concept of what freedom means. It cannot stem from the fact that we are radically different in kind from everything else, because ontologically we're not. Yes, humans may be the most interesting thing in the universe. Who knows? It's possible. It's possible we may be the most capable thing in the universe. We're certainly the most interesting to ourselves. So even if we were, even if there were mightier Lovecraftian beings out there, we would still care about ourselves because we are ourselves. We'd still care about anthropology. But I think when you look at relationality as an ontologist, you have to look at the most basic features of it and not get immediately tangled up in the parts that are most relevant to humans. And what you have is you have the idea of an object, which traditionally was known as a substance, and my objects have many of the features of substances, not all of them. They are self-contained. They are able to bear qualities. They are not themselves qualities, things of this sort. Relations between objects, well, those relations are never going to be able to bring all of their objects into play. You cannot translate an object into another place and have it be the same object, right? You can create a simulacrum of it. You can create a more or less successful model of it, but you cannot move a thing from one place to the other without energy loss. Now, what's interesting is, just recently, I was going back for the first time in years to Kant's refutation of the ontological proof of St. Anselm, because I was writing an article about it. And I noticed something there that I'd never really thought of before, which is that even though Kant is known for saying that we can't really say anything about the things in themselves, it turns out that what he thinks we can't say is simply about their existence, not their essence. And the reason I say this is because his argument against St. Anselm ends up turning on the idea that God in the mind and God in reality do have the same qualities. Because if they didn't, then it wouldn't be an adequate concept of God, and we wouldn't be talking about God anyway. And yet, being is not a real predicate. Therefore, we cannot say that being is one of those qualities. And therefore, we cannot say that the qualities of the God in the mind are instantiated outside the mind. So I was very interested in that. What was your original question was about?
It was more understand the relationship between the difference between object relations and
Oh,
subject
sorry.
object relations. Yeah, I know that was I asked the question in a terrible way because I too am struggling to articulate this, but
No, it's
that
fine.
difference, yeah.
There is, of course, a difference between human object relations and object relations, which is that we have visual data, we hear sounds, we have memories that condition our perception of the things. There are colors involved. So yes, we can list all kinds of things that humans have that presumably inanimate objects do not have, like dreams and ability to plan for the future and any number of other special human faculties. And this is why I'm not a panpsychist, because I don't think we should jump right away into projecting all of the human features onto the non-human things.
Yeah,
That's not
sorry.
what I'm trying to
Yeah, yeah, I was
do.
going to comment on that. It's really interesting that, don't you think that in our, especially in our times, with again, there's a rise of panpsychism, where now, because we've been so stuck in this Kantian paradigm of transcendental, the horizon, that now we're trying to anthropomorphize even objects by saying, oh, objects are conscious and so on. Anyway, sorry for the interruption, but I thought that was as an interesting difference between triple O and panpsychism.
What's interesting to me is that mainstream modern philosophy and panpsychism share something deeply in common, which is their view that consciousness is something so amazing that it must be an ontological property, either one to be jealously hoarded by humans and a few smart animals like dolphins and monkeys, or something so important everything has to have it, or else the universe couldn't keep going. And I don't see it either way. I see consciousness as a special, very interesting kind of object that arose in the world historically at a certain point and has certain limitations, certain abilities that other objects don't have, but that isn't part of the ontological fabric of the universe, that isn't something that had to emerge, that isn't something that would have made a gigantic ontological difference if it hadn't emerged. And so here's where I differ from people like Zizek and people like McGowan and Johnston that you mentioned, who work closely with Zizek, though they're all my friends. I like them very much. And many Lacanians as well. I do not see the subject as some kind of ontological catastrophe in the history of the universe that's different from anything else that came before. I think it may be an extremely important thing to have happened in the history of the universe, but not every important thing that happened in the history of the universe is an important ontological event. The formation of stars was an extremely important step in the history of the universe. What is the ontological significance of the formation of stars? Probably none, right? It's simply an extremely interesting astronomical thing with very important repercussions. So we need to get used to being a little more careful about what we admit into ontology and not put things there just because they're interesting to us as humans. So that's what I would say to that. I don't, for me, the subject, obviously for Zizek and his crew, they're more Hegelians than Lacanians in some way. The subject has to be very ontologically important. For me, it's simply not.
Yeah, I mean, okay, if I could just read out a quote from, since you mentioned Johnston, when I spoke to Professor Johnston, I did, ask him about Triple O, and he was also open to admitting that it's been a while since he looked into your work, and he said he'd rather not comment because you probably have updated some of your views. So, but he did say this, like this is in his book. In fact, I have it right here, A New German Idealism, and he says the subject is the immense absolute power of negativity, the power of introducing a gap or cut into the given immediate substantial unity, the power of differentiating, of abstracting, of tearing apart and treating as self-standing what in reality is part of an organic unity. So what he says here, do you think if a subject was just another kind of object, that you could still say this about this notion of the subject. I mean, I guess I'm trying to still
Right.
retain some kind of what the subject is, but maybe I'm completely mistaken to do so. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, Professor.
No, the passage you just read is a very concise statement of the Ljubljana School research program, of which Adrian is a leading member, this fusion of Hegel and Lacan. And I would simply differ from it by saying, I don't think we need to interpret human thought in terms of the power of negativity. I would approach it very differently. I would appreciate human consciousness as an amazing translator, translation machine, something that's able to displace things from one place to another and magnify and reduce them. So for me, it's not about negativity at all. It's about being able to stretch and compress and link. And you'll end up with a very different model of human thought if you do that. And Adrian's a friend, so I've heard him say these things before. It's fine. We have these debates on email and rarely when we meet in person. We met a couple times in person. So Hegel and Lacan. Okay. First of all, I'm no longer so sure that that fusion works as well as Ljubljana wanted to. I think Hegel is more of an unrolling of the Cartesian tradition, and Lacan is more of a stake through the hearts of the Cartesian tradition, for the reasons mentioned earlier. And that's why I think Lacan maybe has more radical potential for moving us forward, even though he's even more difficult than Hegel in some ways, because he seems to revel in obscurity at times. But, Isabel Stengers once compared reading Whitehead to whale watching, because you get paragraphs and paragraphs of nothing, like boring prose, and suddenly there she blows. You get this amazing formulation. For me, reading Lacan has always been like panning for gold, because there's a lot of mud and water and dirt. And then every now and then a gold nugget in your pan that you kind of sift around and look at, because the guy rambles. He's a terrible prose writer for the most part. So the Accrete, I think, are a lot harder than the seminars.
Oh, for sure. I tried to get through the Accrete, I gave up. Couldn't. It was impenetrable.
He just can't present his own thought that well. But there are some incredible intuitions there, things that no one else has ever thought of. And I see him more as the real threat to modern philosophy in terms of what he does with the identity of the subject, the doubling of the subject. Hegel does a nice inside job with the dialectic of complicating things, but Hegel is still very much involved with the dyad of thought and world as the two major terms of reality, and the dialectic is really about a passage back and forth between those two, so that they become increasingly more implicated with each other and complex. What if those are not the two terms of the dispute? What if it's not about thought and worlds? So I've not written any sort of detailed critique of the dialectic anywhere. I'll have to do that at some point, but the reason I'm not a dialectician is for that reason. I think the dialectic puts too much weight in the ironies of thought basket. And I think already phenomenology saw a number of things that the dialectic method was not able to. And it's always funny. People get confused, beginners to philosophy get confused about this word phenomenology, how it's used in Hegel, but also in Husserl. And throughout my life, I've often seen novices ask professors about this, and I've never yet heard any of them give a good answer to it. Heidegger made this weird response that Husserl's phenomenology is actually close tied to Hegel's logic. Again, I think that's wrong, but it's interesting. I think one of the obvious things is that there aren't really objects in Hegel's phenomenology. Nothing lasts long enough. In Husserl, there are objects that can last for thousands and millions of years and be the object of phenomenological description. Their goal is not to pass on as a mere limited one-sided shape of consciousness into something higher and more unified and more incorporating of the negative. You actually have a thing in front of you that is independent of you, that has an opacity that isn't just the opacity of your thoughts, false oversimplifications of it. So in other words, to get to know the thing doesn't just mean to get to know our transcendental presuppositions about it more explicitly or something like that, right? There's an inner opacity to the objects. It's something that I've never seen a Hegelian do justice to. And just look at Zizek. There's not really much discussion of objects in his work. And so I think this is the part I still retain from phenomenology. And indeed, that's why I call my philosophy an object-oriented philosophy. The fact that I was actually in on Husserl even a little before I was in on Heidegger. Heidegger but then became my real interest. But and in Husserl, who's coming from the Austro-Hungarian tradition, object is the term they use. So when people ask me, why do you use object? Because object always means as opposed to a subject. No, it's because I guess I was coming from that Austro-Hungarian Brentano Husserl Meinong cradle early on, before I was even in Heidegger. And that's the terminology that stuck. Now, where do I differ from that tradition? I think Tristan Garcia, the French philosopher, stated this most clearly to me, that when the Austrian tradition talks about objects, what they're really talking about is objects of thought. So they're talking about objects as objects of possible intention, of perception, judgment, and feeling. When I talk about objects, what I'm talking about is also objects insofar as they interact with each other, which is a subject you don't really find in the Austrian tradition, which in that sense remains too Kantian, I think. It thinks we have somehow first what's given to us is the relation with the object, and we clarify that, the relation of the object to thought. But no, I think we also talk about the objects to each other. And so in that sense, we are not Austrian, we're not Kantian. Now, I feel like I missed some pieces of your Kant question in the midst of all that.
Oh, no, that's totally fine, Professor. In fact, I want to leave the best for last and get to Kant towards the end of the conversation. In fact, you perfectly answered my question. My question was again, yeah, how do you like if you reject this notion of negativity of the subject that a lot of Hegelians like to speak of, I can see how that this, yeah, in some sense help us reformulate both, as you said, human freedom, but also what a subject is. Because you're right. I mean, I don't know, as far as I know, no non-sentient entity does the work of abstraction, categorization the way we do. And that's why I still find it's a bit like mind-blowing at the fact that, yeah, because another point here would be, like yourself, certainly Professor Adrian Johnson, and I've read this book of his carefully, the one he calls The Philosophy of Weak Nature. He does say that the subject emerges out of the objects. I mean, it's out of the world of objects. Like for him, it's not like, I don't know, and in the beginning there was like a subject, and then in some sense, for Hegelians, the notions that this negativity cuts through substance and subject, right? So it's like and that's how they that's like the ontology, this notion of this, which Zizek calls the primordial abyss. I don't know, there are different ways he puts it, the destruction, a catastrophe, and this kind of the way he puts it. So I think you
It's
certainly
creationism in a way.
say
So
again.
it resembles creationism.
In many ways, yeah. And then he says, he brings in the Christian atheism and he says that, uh, Adam and Eve had to fall retroactively. When you look at it, that had to happen. It was that the error had to happen for this to emerge, whatever, this is. Um, but no, as I said, Professor, I want to leave the Kant conversation, which is this your paper, The Only Exit from Modern Philosophy, for last, because I think that really is where where the rubber hits the road. And I should probably mention this too. It seems to me, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, that we're at some kind of crossroads at the moment. So for me, the future of thought, both when I mean thought, I mean at a high level, both like the sciences, but probably even the humanities, all of that would either follow some sort of subject-oriented ontology. And what I mean by that is even physicists like, Karen Barad, who wrote the book Meeting the Universe Halfway, where like you bring in consciousness into like the observer, into the quantum universe, or it'll go towards the object-oriented ontology that you put forward, that you and your colleagues put forward. Uh, and that's probably where the future of thought will go, because it's like we can't forever be lost in this dualism, perhaps that Kant put forward. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious as to what your thoughts on that are, because I mean, I see so much of this thoughts of like idealism and panpsychism coming up in just like the kind of discourse in contemporary philosophy. And for me, a part of that is because we haven't figured out how to speak of objects independent of subjects.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to respond to there. First, let me say something about Barad, whose book I really enjoy. I think it's one of the weighty theoretical books in continental philosophy of the 21st century, and I'm glad it's being widely read, and I'm glad it's around. The difference between Triple O and Barad's perspective can be seen in her title, Meeting the Universe Halfway, because it shows that she also thinks thought and world are the two basic terms, and they ought to meet halfway, as though the problem is that we were being too extreme about one or the other. I think the problem is that we take those two to be the basic terms of the universe to begin with. No one would ever say peanut butter and jelly should meet halfway, because we know those aren't important enough to merit an ontology where they're each playing half a role. So you have to make sure you choose your terms properly. And I admit I'm in the minority on this. Most philosophers still follow this, but I think that's the most important thing to get beyond. I think that is the basic failed assumption underlying more stuff than anything else. This idea that there's thoughts and then there's the world. Well, we either negotiate a compromise between them or we become radical pro-world people or radical pro-thought people. That's why start with two. There's trillions of things out there. And again, if you don't start with the assumption that human thought is some kind of ontologically unique relation to everything else, however interesting and deviant it might be in many ways, if you start with objects and relations, which is the more basic ontological way to do it, stuff starts looking very different. Let me talk about Hegelian negativity, because yes, I know that's very popular, also because of the leftist results it had in history with Marx. And Marx is very big right now due to everyone's frustration with global capitalism at the moment. Hegel's negativity is in many ways the culmination of the critical tradition of modern thought. This idea that, say, Descartes' radical doubt, that I'm going to start by tearing down all of my beliefs and then only reconstructing and accepting the rational ones. And that what an intellectual is supposed to do is to reject anything that just comes from tradition. So we reject religion, we reject gender roles, we reject heterosexuality as a binding model. This is what the intellectuals have taught themselves to do. Find anything that is some way maybe historically contingent and denounce it and say that it needs to be regrounded in terms of reason. All right, well, some of the problems with that, first of all, it's impossible. Take any average American high school student who imagines himself the next Descartes, let's say undergraduate, and goes through this radical doubt, and it may be very sincere. They may spend a week sulking in their dormitory room, questioning everything. I think a lot of us have been through that.
I've been through that for sure. Yeah.
What's
I've been through that for sure. I had a
sure.
new
Most
atheist
philosophy majors
questioning everything. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Most philosophy majors have, and yet they haven't really radically doubted everything because they've assumed a certain individualism that is very Western, that they have the ability to rip themselves away from their whole context and make individual judgments about everything. They're assuming that the monotheism they denounce hasn't infiltrated their thoughts in all kinds of different ways they're not educated enough to identify yet. And so it's really wrong to start with doubts as the basic model for how thought works. What we really are, if you compare us to animals, what's really different between us and animals is that we believe in a lot more than animals. We don't like to think of ourselves that way because we like to think of science as critical. But I think what science really is most remarkable for is how much stuff it makes us believe in. I believe in all these stars billions of light years away that I've never seen and I'm never going to see. I believe in microscopic viruses and particles. I believe in subatomic particles. How can I believe in all those things that an animal would certainly never believe in? It's because we are, Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science, would call this fiduciary, right? That we trust, we believe. This is our primary mode of interacting with things. It's actually rare, very rare, that if someone offers us a favor that we suspect they're planning to stab us in the back, right? Most of the time, you trust what people say, unless you have experience of the person as being unreliable. So the experience of doubting or being skeptical is a rather special case, not necessarily a higher case. Just look at the fact that people who have a lesser quantitative amount of religious belief are often not better people and often do not produce better work. I mean, you can find all kinds of examples of deeply pious artists, even scientists, which suggests we need to look a little more at the functions of belief. And the fact that all of our beliefs and everything are being eroded by conspiracy theories, I think shows to what extent that's true, that people are hungering for new standards by which to believe in something. I think this is part of why nonfiction books sales have been soaring. J.G. Ballard said one of my favorite things about art ever. He said, the role of the artist is changing in our time. The artist used to be the one who had to produce fictions. Today, we are surrounded by fictions. So the artist is the one who produces realities you can believe in. And so we like sequels. We like worlds that certain artists create that we can inhabit. We like Netflix series that create worlds like The Wire or Breaking Bad, that we can inhabit those worlds for 7 years and get to know those characters. And so I think humans have a deep need to believe in something. So I think a better way to look at knowledge formation has to do with the fact that we're going to just largely believe a lot of what we hear. And then in a few special places, we're going to challenge conventional wisdom, but only in order to believe something more deeply than the conventional wisdom. A person who's a creator has to be almost religiously committed to an idea in order to be able to spread that enthusiasm to others. And maybe even somewhat diluted. I was leading Sloterdijk's World Interior of Capital last night, and he was talking about the power of these early global explorers like Magellan and da Gama, their ability to spread delusion among their crew about the riches that awaited them, because this is what it took. And their use of incredibly violent discipline, even against members of the aristocracy, for anyone who even dared mention turning around and going home. And I wouldn't ever recommend going that far, but this just goes to show to what extent belief has more of a role in our economy of knowledge than the critical model of negativity would want you to believe. So he's one example. Polanyi. Another example, who the critical thinkers aren't going to lack, is Cardinal Newman, the figure of the British Catholic Church, who wrote that famous book on the grammar of assent, where he was also trying to show there are lots of ways in which we finally assent to something that have no possible bearing on, no possible link to the scientific method, right? Learning to trust the character of certain people or distrust it, things like that. There are many ways of learning to trust or distrust something. And critical negativity is just part of an ecosystem there. It doesn't, I don't think I would ever go so far as to say it characterizes human subjectivity as a whole.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not a Hegelian, and I'm also not sure that that's what Lacan thinks. I think they're bending Lacan too much to Hegel's wishes there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an old-fashioned romantic. For me, the best example is falling in love, you know. I mean, there's no way if you can use a critical method. My partner's probably gonna listen to this. If I use a critical method, we would have ended our relationship years ago, you know.
Love's
So
a great example
yeah.
because you don't love someone because they have a bundle of good qualities. And Zizek's all over this, as is Lacan, right? That if you tell somebody you're in love with this person because of these 12 things, to the person you're telling this to, they're not going to fall in love with them necessarily. To them, it's just another person. They're lacking that certain je ne sais quoi. They're lacking the objet, as Lacanians call it. I might differ with how Zizek interprets the objet, but it's very important, the stuff he says about that, I think. That this is why getting a fantasized object of desire is often disappointing. There's something about it that's not quite right, even if all the desired qualities seem to be there. And I think that's another important insight, along with Husserl's, into the difference between the object and its qualities.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, Professor. You said at the beginning of the conversation that you've been reading Lacan a bit more deeply in the past, I don't know, a few years, a few months. I mean, it makes sense. In one seminar, Lacan says that, he says he's bringing back Freud, but he also says that his only real concept, his only real contribution is the objet. That's the only thing he really, and so the fact
Which seminar is that?
I can't remember which one, Professor. I'm wondering if it's the four discourses or something, but I'll look it up and send it across. But I still remember, um, uh,
Might be fundamental concepts, you mean? Yeah.
yeah, the fundamental concepts. I think where he says it's really the only thing that he contributed in some sense. But the point I'm trying to make here is the whole notion of yeah, I mean, being an object-oriented ontologist, it makes sense to speak of this kind of the object that is in there, like the virtual object in some sense. I don't know what your thoughts on that would be, because that's in many ways that's my understanding of the object, kind of like yeah, the object that is in there. Anyway, so the okay, I really wanted to get to your. We spoke a lot on onto-taxonomy, but again, I think we still have a bit of time to discuss this other book, Objects Untimely, and this is again a brilliant,
Before we
brilliant
do
book.
that,
Huh?
before we do that, can
Yes.
I finish up the thought on Merleau-Ponty and Schelling, because I think I got sidetracked.
Yes. I was gonna ask you that at the end because you end maybe you know what,
Okay.
let's just get to that because I literally have a statement from you on from the essay on Ponty and Schelling. So maybe we'll discuss that when we come to that because I think that the way you end the essay, the only exit from one philosophy, you do speak that we need Schelling and Ponty. So it's up to you. Do you want to talk about it now or we'll touch on it later?
No, we'll go to Objects Untimely. That's what's your plan. That's fine.
Yeah. Great. So, all right. So, again, excellent book. I didn't read the whole book. I kind of read more of the essays that you wrote, the philosophy essays. And let me just open up the first of all, there's almost like an axiom that you put out here. You say, objects generate time. Now I want to ask you to please elaborate on that and why do you give salience to objects over time. However, just to make things a bit more interesting, let's start on a bit of a again a biographical note here. Yeah, why do you? It's interesting. I mean, as a philosopher of Triple O, why do you decide to philosophize on archaeology when discussing the relationship between time and objects? Like, what's the history of this book? Like, as in how you wrote it.
History of that book is simply that Christopher Whitmore, my co-author, started corresponding with me years ago. He was one of the earlier people to write to me and start engaging in discussion. And I think he may have still been a PhD student at Stanford at the time. I'm forgetting the details exactly, but Chris is now a professor of Texas Tech in the classics department. He concentrates on ancient Greek archaeology. He's digging in Samothrace every summer. And at some point, he had me come to Texas Tech to give some lectures. And that was where the idea of this collaboration first began. He tape recorded a conversation we had, and we discovered one of the things we have in common is an idea that objects shape time rather than the reverse. So what does that mean? Well, this is not a completely unprecedented thing. For instance, in Bruno Latour's actor network tradition, this is a common idea, the idea that there's no such thing as time. What happens is that certain actors create asymmetries that give rise to before and after, whereas modernity has this linear conception of time that certain things are irrational or outdated or pre-modern, and they're condemned to the dustbin, they will never return. Well, of course, we see now that lots of stuff is returning. So when I was growing up, I assumed that slavery and piracy were both things of the past. Well, guess what? They're increasing. And some people say there's more of both now than there has ever been in human history. I don't know if that's true, but it's possible, right? And so leeches are coming back as a treatment for bullet wounds or maggots, right? So things that you think are horribly outdated can come back at any time. And I think part of what Latour was thinking about was the fact that many French intellectuals supported the Iranian Revolution under the assumption that, all this religious language is just surface stuff. What this is really about is socialism, right? So we're advancing freedom for the Iranian masses. Well, guess what? It wasn't. Turned out it was a very
It was in fact deeply religious.
reactionary, oppressive, theocratic movement. And Latour says for he and many French intellectuals, that's the movement that their faith in modernity was truly shaken. This idea that things are going from worse to better, and that the archaic stuff is inevitably dying. So for Latour, what happens, it's an object that creates an asymmetry, and you can't really say what's modern and what's non-modern, or what's modern and what's pre-modern. So that's no longer we never thought someone like Trump could get elected again. He seemed to be representing things that we thought we had overcome. We never imagined in the US that reproductive freedom would really be reversed. We thought there were too many educated young women in the country voting to allow that to happen. Somehow it happens. So the arrow of time doesn't work the way liberal modernists thought it had, or even leftist modernists. So anyway, also, going back to the history of physics and philosophy, there's that famous debate in the early 1700s between Leibniz and Clarke, who was Newton's surrogate, about whether space and time are objective, empty containers in which things happen, like Newton thought, or whether time and space are actually produced by objects. And Newton was the original winner in that debate, because I guess there wasn't really any hard evidence that necessitated Leibniz's theory being right until Einstein's general relativity made Leibniz look like the winner. So what I'm interested in here is the way in which times proceed at different rates. So one of the things that's always made me be suspicious about historicism, and I don't like anti-historicism because anti-historicism is too married to this idea of perennial truths, which I don't believe in either, or even less, but historicism often seems to rely too much on the idea that there's this general atmosphere in which everything is bathed and everything kind of develops together, so that if there's an advance going on in painting, it must be mirrored in philosophy somehow, when in fact these things happen at very different times. Sometimes certain fields are always very fertile and ripening while others are stagnant. And so I think you have to look at the world as a union of many different simultaneous times. And I think maybe the best image of this is Michel Serres' image of the car. When you look at a car, it has wheels, which are Stone Age inventions. It has fire, which is a Stone Age mastery. It has glass, which I guess is an ancient Egyptian discovery. It has the internal combustion engine, which is a late 19th century discovery. And then it has some of the latest computer technology. And with a Tesla, which we drive, it has updated software that I might have downloaded last week. So you can't really pinpoint where the car is in time. It's a weaving together of many different historical periods, many different innovations. Latour also makes the funny remark that if you look at your own habits, some of your habits, like handshaking, are tens of thousands of years old. Some, like cooking your food, are maybe over 100,000 years old, and other habits you might have picked up a couple of days ago, like going to a certain coffee shop. So even with humans, this is the case. We are woven together from many different times. And so the idea that there's this single line at which everything moves called modernity, it simply denies the heterogeneity out of which everything is pieced together. And so I think, and he as an archaeologist had much the same sense, that it's often the objects themselves that define the time periods. And you can see this even in names like Bronze Age, Iron Age, Neolithic, things that are named after objects rather than the reverse. So those are some of the thoughts that went into it. And of course, I have more philosophical.
Now, of course, the first kind of, let's say, opposition that you get for this is like, when you mean time, what kind of time are you talking about? Is it the Bergsonian time, the Einsteinian time? So this is the time of physics. Yeah. So if you could kind of give us a different definition for that.
Sure. There's that familiar debate between Bergsonian time and the time of physics, in the sense that all the laws of physics could run twice as fast and it wouldn't make a difference. It would only make a difference to someone who experiences durée, like a human who has to stir the sugar and wait for it to dissolve. And yeah, it's a very nice debate. In the case of object-oriented ontology, we try to put real time somewhere else. Time is an aesthetic phenomenon. And remember, for me, aesthetics means the tension between objects and their qualities. And it's for me, there are four kinds of such tension, depending on whether you're talking about real objects and real qualities, real objects and sensual qualities. Don't need to go through all that here. There are four fundamental tensions, and one of them is time. And actually, you know how in physics, theories are usually liked if they predict new forces or new particles. Well, what I like about, one of the things I like about triple O is that I predicted two new peers for time and space, right? We've always assumed that time and space, there's nothing else belonging in that duo. I've added essence and eidos to that list because I've reinterpreted time and space as being two forms of object quality tension and named the two others. And I think that's one of the most fertile discoveries of triple O so far. But for me, time is about the distinction between the tension between objects and their qualities in the sensual realm, meaning in the realm of experience. And what we talk about with scientific time is we're simply talking about expressing everything in terms of certain object-object interactions that happen in a very regular fashion. So the atomic motion that is used in atomic clocks, for example, that's what we mean by objective time. But that's all it really is. It's the election of an arbitrary standard, certain atomic motions, to be our standard for what counts as real time, while everything else is subjective or derivative. And as you've noticed, probably there are some chapters in the book where I try to compare this to other philosophical conceptions of time. And I think one of the things I'm most bothered by is the idea of time as, I call it, a wind tunnel. As if time were this force, like the wind, Father Time, as if things were just sitting around, and then this thing called time comes in and blows us really fast towards our ends. And that's not really what happens. I see time as something internal to objects, where objects themselves engage in a certain number of interactions, and many of those interactions will tend to degrade them. And this is why they're mortal, or why they're finite. They eventually run down. It's not because there's this objective force outside objects called time that pushes everything in a certain direction. And so I said a lot against the critique of time as a wind tunnel, and especially against a few of my critics I mentioned in the book. So Wolfendale, the critic who wrote a 400-some page attack book on me, for instance, has a lot of negative stuff to say about my theory of time, as he has a lot of negative stuff to say about anything I say. But he claims that also that there needs to be this encompassing thing called time that moves things along, or else nothing could ever change. Whereas I hold, by contrast, that that's too Newtonian. That's basically Newton's objective empty container time. And what really is happening is that what we call time is change being driven by objects.
Indeed, indeed. Professor, are you familiar with the work of the founders of quantum loop gravity? So this is Lee Smolin and Carlo Rovelli. I mean, they very much do, especially Carlo Rovelli is very explicit with this. They reject the notion of time, and they say, in fact, they're more, it's about events. Like for Carlo Rovelli especially, he says events come first. And I'm curious, have you looked into their work, and what your thoughts on?
I have looked at their work. Smolin is a bit too relational in his outlook for me, and that's fine. Sometimes you can be opposites, and it turns out you actually agree. I've never met Smolin and discussed this with him. Be interesting to at some point. So I think he took the wrong side of Leibniz when he got into Leibniz. He took the relational side rather than the monadic side. One of the things that's always drawn me about Rovelli is his complaint that he's tired of philosophers limping along and praising what the sciences have already done. Why don't the philosophers jump out and look ahead? And we've lost the ability to do that because we've lost our self-confidence as anything more than valets to the natural sciences. And that's one of the reasons I think we need to strip the natural sciences of their monopoly on inanimate things, because I think philosophers do have something to contribute there. And I think they would very much appreciate hearing new ideas about this, because you never know which philosophical ideas might prove valuable to science down the line. When Leibniz had his debate with Clarke, I don't think he could have imagined that an Einstein would come along whose theory would fit so nicely with his own. So yes, I also like that Smolin in particular has argued against the commonplace notion of space-time that we get in the post-Einstein landscape. That there must be something fundamentally different about time. I agree with that. I don't think you can just put them in an equation as an extra dimension of the equation. I think that they are two different kinds of tension of object and quality, and that space has actually more contact with the real than time does. Time is what we call time is primarily an experiential thing, and that space has more of a contact with the real. And then essence and eidos being the other two, those have to do with more recondite, difficult to describe tensions between objects and qualities. And then if you've ever read my book on H.P. Lovecraft, you'll know I even find analogs of those four in Lovecraft's fiction, although two of them are the most dominant, the spatial one and the temporal one.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I haven't read it, but I'll order it. I mean, in fact, Professor, we can talk about this offline if you want. I can try and organize a dialogue between Lee Small and yourself, because
Oh, I would love that.
yeah, because his health is, unfortunately, it's improving. He had a lot of health issues, and I think now he's improving and he's doing public talks again. So I can try to make that happen if you're open to it.
Wonderful. I'd be absolutely interested in that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this is the perfect segue to get into the topic of the big bad guy, Kant, because you said that the reason science has this monopoly is because, yes, after Kant, in many ways, philosophy can't speak of objects independent of the subject, and so on, as we kind of discussed in this conversation too. So, Professor, let's just ask again a very fundamental question. So, yeah, this essay you shared with me, which was excellent. Thank you for sharing that. We already discussed this notion of the onto-taxonomy. However, I'll just ask you this. In your opinion, in your view, is Kant the enemy of metaphysics?
No, I think we have to focus on the positive in Kant. And ironically, that positive is the part that everyone wants to forget, namely the thing in itself. It's the strangest thing that Kant, undoubtedly the most influential philosopher since Plato and Aristotle, launched his revolution with the notion of the thing in itself, and yet the thing in itself has itself come to be interpreted as a form of dogmatism. I get a lot of critiques of my philosophy that are essentially, critiques of the thing in itself. People forget that, no, the thing in itself is what prevents dogmatic metaphysics from working.
He was trying to save metaphysics, right? From dogma.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not possible in its dogmatic form. But the way you stop dogma is with the thing in itself. The thing in itself is not a piece of dogma. That's a German idealist addition. This idea that the things in themselves are themselves contradictory and therefore a residual piece of dogmatism. No. The finitude of cognition is Kant's central breakthrough, and that is, it's the thing in itself that allows him to do that. Now, the mistake that's made is that people also, and not just people, Kant himself did this, people attach that too readily to the other part of the Kantian package, which is that, therefore, the proper role of philosophy is simply to critique the transcendental conditions of access to reality. Because we are humans, and therefore we only have access in human experience to human stuff. We do not have access to what goes on in nature, and therefore we cannot talk about it. That would be dogmatism. But there's an equivocation here, I think. Dogmatism means trying to talk about a thing as though we had direct access to its properties, as though the thing were directly present before us and could be exhaustively described. It's not dogmatism if you talk about something that's not you, as long as you're aware that it too is something you can't talk about in terms of all of its properties exhaustively. So the critique of dogmatism means that I cannot prove using reason that God exists, for Kant. It doesn't mean that I can't talk about what would happen if what happens metaphysically when two dinosaurs are fighting, or when fire burns cotton, the famous Islamic example from the Middle Ages. And there's an odd tendency to make a Kantian flavored response that you can't talk about fire burning cotton because that's outside of human experience. You'd be dogmatic if you're talking about it. No, you wouldn't. You can talk about fire burning cotton just as readily as you can talk about your own minds, because as mentioned in our reflections on psychoanalysis, we don't have any more direct access to our own mind than we do to fire burning cotton.
Yeah.
So those are on the same level. Those are on the same level. They are both equally valid topics of philosophy: causation, introspection. Introspection is not any more readily accessible to us than physical causation. Okay, now the second defense mechanism kicks in here, and people say, yeah, but science already does that. And you're going to tell science what to do when it comes to fire? You're going to end up with a crazy metaphysics of nature like Schelling. Aren't we past that? Ha ha ha. Okay, but again, that assumes that the natural sciences are telling us everything we need or can know about inanimate objects, because yes, it's the best we can do when it comes to mathematized spatiotemporal descriptions of how certain physical things interact when they come together. But that's not the only thing going on when two objects interact, because as mentioned, objects contain subcomponents, they are emergent in some way, interactions take place at all of those levels, and boiling them all down to the language of physics isn't necessarily going to get you all of those. In fact, we know it isn't. We know it isn't. And then another defense mechanism that kicks in is people say, okay, then tell me how object-oriented ontology is going to help physics, which again begs the question. It's saying that unless something cashes out in the results of physics, it's worthless when it comes to inanimate nature. So the answer is possibly object-oriented ontology will contribute nothing to physics. Another possible answer is that in 40 years, it's very relevant for physics. That some of the concepts of ontology could be picked up by physics, just like some of Kant's and Leibniz's and Mach's were by physicists. Physicists have always known this, at least until the Anglophone kind of anti-intellectual scientists of the post-war era. The Feynman is sometimes accused of this, and Hawking deserves a bit of it. Whereas the continental European physicists always had a bit more of a reflective, theoretical side. You've got Bohr reading Kierkegaard and Einstein reading all kinds of stuff from the history of philosophy. So we shouldn't be intimidated by the anti-philosophy attitudes of the Feynmans and the Hawkings. And even in Feynman's case, it isn't that clear. There is a lot of stuff out there that physics is not the right medium to discuss. And this is very clear in the case of aesthetics. I've mentioned it in the case of law. And so we can celebrate the greatness of physics. Modern physics is certainly one of the greatest human achievements of all time, the things that it's opened up and also the perils it's opened up. But that does not mean we should all bow down and say, how may I serve thee, master, which is unfortunately how many analytic philosophers behave towards the sciences. So that's the first thing that needs to happen, is people need to accept that there are many discourses about the world that are fruitful, that are not necessarily scientific discourses in the usual sense. Okay, that's the first thing. The other thing, of course, they have to accept is that we do not have direct introspective knowledge. That's more of a statement aimed at the transcendental idealists, philosopher types. They ought to study a little more psychoanalysis and see how opaque our introspection really is and how mediated it is. And then we're going to see that the two poles of the Kantian division of labor don't necessarily work that well. And in a sense, Triple O is a Kantianism. It's just a Kantianism that isn't just about the human subject. It's one in which finitude and the thing in itself also infiltrates inanimate interactions. And that's, I think, what's new about Triple O in the philosophical story. You have Whitehead placing, again, all causal relations on the same footing as perceptual immediacy, but Whitehead's a thorough relationist in his ontology. So he thinks the objects are nothing more than their relations, whereas Triple O is saying the opposite, that there's a surplus in these relations, and that these relations are just as tragically doomed as the human romantic's failure to grasp the meaning of a ruined temple. The same thing happens at the inanimate level.
Yeah.
So, but
No, I mean, I just want to add here, you put it succinctly in that essay you've said here, is for the listener really. The only way to escape this assumption, the only exit from modern philosophy, is to cease conceiving of the thing in itself as something unknowable to humans and to reconceive it as the excess in things beyond any of their relations to each other. I,
Right.
I thought that was beautifully put.
Thanks. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh, you gotta thank your past self for that.
Right.
Yeah, so
That's the best experience in reading your own work, by the way. Going back through and reading a claim in one of your past writings and saying, yeah, but now someone could say this, and then you answer it in the next paragraph.
correct.
So
That's a great feeling. I can
it
imagine.
is.
And
Yep.
I, I've got to admit I'm yet to fully experience that because I'm an idiot.
Well,
So
no,
so
you're not.
so Professor, one more question. Okay, before we continue, I've got to ask. I'm so sorry we've gone over time. Is it okay? Are you feeling all right? Or
I am.
yeah, I promise maybe another 15, 20 minutes tops. I apologize.
As
I
long
should
as
have.
we don't miss Merleau-Ponty and Schelling.
Oh yeah, yeah. As I told you, absolutely. I've got a whole bit of an excerpt on that I want to read out before we get to that. That's very important.
Okay.
So yeah, the question of appearance, right? I mean, I I remember reading about this a while back when I was reading Triple O. So the book on Triple O. Now, of course, Hegelians also reject the thing in itself, and they even kind of, for them, the essence is split in itself. That's why they appear and so on. But I'm curious, in object-oriented ontology, you too reject the thing in itself, or do you reconceive it as as per this excerpt that I read?
I accept the thing in itself because there is not a commensurability between the thing and any causal effect of the thing. So, in other words, a thing and the version of that thing that anything interacts with are not going to be identical. When a fire burns a cotton ball, obviously countless features of that cotton ball are completely irrelevant to the fire's interaction with it. And yet those qualities are to some extent part of the cotton. It's just that no entity is equipped to interact with all of the qualities of another entity. And this is also incidentally why I reject the concept of matter. I think the entire reason the concept of matter exists in the history of philosophy is to provide an alibi for how one thing can move into another without changing. But
Yeah.
specifically, in classical model of knowledge, supposedly when I know a horse, the form of the horse comes into my mind, though the matter of the horse obviously does not, or else I'd have a giant horse in my head. Okay. But what if there is no such substratum called matter that's able to hold this horse form in it so that the only difference between the horse in reality and the horse in my mind is that one is in matter and the other is not. No one's ever seen this matter. All we've ever seen are forms. All we've ever detected are forms. We've never detected formless matter. And I think a better model of knowledge is that the form is transferred. It's like transmitting communications down the line. There's going to be some noise, some distortion, some signal loss. And this is how knowledge works as well. It might not all be loss. It might also be enhancements. It might be that humans are able to see more in a thing than is actually there, for instance. But knowledge is a form of translation. This is why I consider humans the translating animals rather than the critical animals. We're able to bring vastly different things together into the same medium. And obviously, economics is one of the more controversial manifestations of this. You put a price on everything. That's the most extreme example of bringing all heterogeneous things together under one yoke. But that's an essential tendency in human beings. We might need to control it in certain ways, but that's who we are. That's what we do. We put things under a single yoke. We believe in more, we link more. So there's grounds for a new anthropology here, a new philosophical anthropology.
Yes, I've got another good quote for this from you here. You say, Triple O holds with Latour that there is no transport without transformation. A
Right.
form does not move, whether from the thing to the mind or any other manner, without undergoing some sort of translation.
in this age, and you end rather provocatively, you say, in this age of resurgent materialism, we need less materialism and more formalism.
Right.
Excellent.
That's deliberate provocation.
Yeah, it's a good provocation. And on the note of provocations, Professor, now let's get to the kind of more of the crux of the matter, let's say, which is Schelling and Merleau-Ponty. And the reason I kept sort of stalling you was because I wanted to read this quote again from the essay. And again, I'll leave a link to the essay in the description down below for the listeners. You've got to read this. I wish to propose a related maxim that might well annoy some readers. You say, Schelling and Merleau-Ponty are the philosophers of the future and always will be. The problem is, though, that both Schelling and Merleau-Ponty are modern onto-taxonomists to the core. So, yes, could you please elaborate on that statement and then comment on what you want to say on Schelling and Ponty?
Right. The thing I was alluding to in the article was that there's a certain country, and I'll name it here. That country is Brazil. You'll often hear people say Brazil is the country of the future. And then you'll often hear cynics say Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. And I guess I don't know if they're trying to say that Brazil will never get its act together and reach its full potential or whatever they mean. I have nothing against Brazil. I've been there many times and love it. But I use that same cynical witticism with respect to Merleau-Ponty and Schelling to make a point, which is if you go through a continental philosophy education, as I did, the two classical figures in that canon who were always held up as being pregnant with mysterious future possibilities. If only we could figure out what these people were really saying, we'd move on to the 23rd century. That would be Merleau-Ponty and Schelling. And it's easy to see why that's the case. You know, in the case of Schelling, he gives us the chance of countering possibly sterile Hegelian rational dialectic with all these obscure undercurrents and theories of magnetism and things like this. And so there's this current of people in continental philosophy who take up the idea, also supported by Heidegger, that maybe Schelling is the more advanced thinker than Hegel. And then you've got others like Zizek who like them both. Anyway, there are always Schelling renaissances every 20 years or so in continental philosophy. And that's because he's seen as this mysterious future figure. My point is that if you already see somebody as a mysterious future figure, they're probably not the future. They're probably a projection of the present. They probably seem like a slightly more far out version of the present, because when the future comes, it truly surprises you. It's almost disorienting because you don't see it. And I quote that remark from when after the war, Alfred North Whitehead is worried about nuclear calamity. And his interviewer says, what could prevent this calamity? And Whitehead says something like, only the appearance of a half dozen or so eminent men. And his questioner says, do you see such men on the horizon? And Whitehead said, they don't appear on the horizon. They appear in our midst, and they're not at once easy to identify. So in other words, you don't imagine who's going to save the Democratic Party now that it's in ruins after Trump's victory. Here's what we need. We need these 5 qualities, and we need somebody who bundles these 5 qualities. That's not the way it's going to work. It's probably going to be something surprising. We might be able to predict a few of their features, like that they, maybe they won't be taking corporate donations as much as Kamala Harris, whatever. You might be able to predict a few of them, but it's still going to be surprising, no doubt. No one ever expected Trump would be the Republican solution after Obama beat Romney in 2012. That was the shock. But he's something the electorate obviously wanted. Okay, well, let me give you another example before I move on to Merleau-Ponty, and that example is Maurice Blanchot. Because when I was in graduate school in the early 90s, Blanchot was the new mysterious future figure. Everybody watch out. Blanchot's going to change everything. That once we figure this out, Jacques Derrida wrote a blurb on the back of one of Blanchot's books saying, Blanchot is still ahead of us, still waits for us to come. Never as much as today have I imagined him so far ahead of us. Okay, I want to make a couple of points about that, though. One of them is that was 32 years ago. And continental philosophy is not much more Blanchoian than it was in 1992. So the prediction failed. Is that because we still haven't caught up with them? That's looking less and less likely. What looks more likely to me is that Blanchot was simply the far out futuristic projection of where we were with Derrida in 1992. And I can also guarantee you that I think Jacques Derrida's admiration for Blanchot was genuine, but I don't think he found him the least bit threatening. It was the same basic kind of work. The person far ahead of us who Derrida didn't identify would have been someone Derrida probably would have found threatening, someone he couldn't foresee. Okay, so that brings us to Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty's relation to Husserl is analogous to Hegel's relation with Schelling in the sense that some people might think Husserl's an old schoolmaster bore who thinks like a professor and just wants us to sit in a room analyzing things we see, whereas Merleau-Ponty's this more dashing figure who is more alert to the sensual contours of the universe and
the body,
is aware of all these, the body. But again, he's still dealing with thought and worlds. And I'll say two things about that. One of them is that the body is the very embodiment, no pun intended, of Barad's meeting the universe halfway. The body is what meets thought and the universe halfway, right? Because it's ours, but it's also physical. And so it's supposed to be this privileged meeting point of the two Cartesian substances. Great, but what if the two Cartesian substances were a sham in the first place? What if there weren't two? What if there were trillions of different substances? Because thought wasn't a special kind of them. So that already yields way too much, right? As I once put it to Tom Sparrow, I think this was the first interview I ever did. If someone came up to you and said something really stupid like, these two pieces of wood are the entire universe, you don't disprove them by gluing the two pieces together. You disprove them by pointing out that those are only two pieces of wood and there's a lot more out there. And instead, modern philosophy has chosen to glue the two pieces of wood together, which is a pretty lame solution to it. They've done it because they think one of those pieces of wood is so precious that it must be part of the final combination, thoughts. But it's still the wrong solution. So with Merleau-Ponty, you've got body, then later you get the flesh, an even more advanced version in which the world looks at us just as we look at it. And Lacan, of course, makes a big deal of this with the sardine can looking back at us in the Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. But how radical is it to say the world looks at us too? Because again, you're sticking with the same thought world pair that we've had since Descartes, and that was there in germ even maybe in St. Augustine. It's been there a long time. It has Christian roots, probably, this idea that the human soul is something so important as an object of salvation that it deserves to be half of reality. So I don't think that's the way to go. You don't do it just by taking parts of the modern dogma and pasting them together. You have to do it by questioning the modern dogma at its roots. And this is why, for me, I'm in the minority on this. For my money, Bruno Latour is the most important philosopher since the Second World War. And why don't people believe this? Okay, well, analytic philosophers wouldn't believe it because they think he's a social constructionist. And that's not entirely false. He leans too much to that side sometimes. He leans too much to the side of saying that Ramses II couldn't really have died of tuberculosis because it wasn't discovered yet in ancient Egypt. So I understand why scientific realists detest that kind of move. I don't like it either. Much as I loved Latour as a person, we were friends from 1999 to the end of his life, 23 years. Continental philosophers wouldn't accept Latour as an important philosopher because he works entirely outside of the transcendental dogma, where it's all about thought and world. It's about a bunch of objects in a network interacting with each other. And yes, ultimately the human still has too privileged a position, but he certainly does a lot more to get out of it than I think anyone before, other than Whitehead maybe. And you could see Latour and Whitehead working in the same general direction, except that Latour is more of a philosopher of science rather than a philosopher of nature. So he's more focused on the details of how he thinks the sciences work. And I don't always love Latour as a philosopher of science. I love him more as a metaphysician because I think in the philosophy of science, he is too dismissive of the idea of something outside of the theories that the theories are trying to point at. He tends to over-identify the scientific object with all of the means that were used to detect it. So I think the analytic philosophers would have a grain of truth in their critique there. But one thing he does exceptionally well, along with Whitehead, is to ask us to not begin with assumptions about what ontological zones things belong in. Latour does that, unfortunately, by overusing a single criterion, which is how the thing affects other things. So an actor is something that affects, something is real if it affects something else for Latour. For me, something can be real and not currently affect anything else and maybe never affect anything else, but it can still be real. You wouldn't detect it, but there's that possibility, because to be real doesn't mean to have an effect. To be real means to not be reducible to qualities. That's my definition of it. And I think Merleau-Ponty is simply a more exotic form of modern philosophy than the others, but he's not going to get us to the promised land. He's not going to get us out of this closed circle of modern thought where it's all about the thought world interaction. I don't think naturalism is going to get us there either, but for the reasons I've mentioned. Certainly don't think social constructionism is going to get us there. So I think we need a totally new approach, one in which we don't start with that assumption.
Indeed, yeah. I find that really interesting because, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar, but Merleau-Ponty's work has completely been taken into and absorbed into, cognitive sciences, 4E cognition, embodied cognitive science. I mean, my background is in computer science, but I'm doing a master's in the philosophy of AI, and my supervisor very much works through Merleau-Ponty's notion, and it's exactly what you said. It's because this body is the embodiment of this thought world distinction where it comes together. So
I want to clarify that I think Merleau-Ponty is a great philosopher of the body, a foundational philosopher of the body.
Undoubtedly.
I just don't think the theory of the body deserves to be fundamental ontology.
Yeah. And like exactly, like my supervisor, she's not a metaphysician. She's philosophizing on just kind of what is, AI kind of currently as we see them, not in metaphysics per se. But Professor, what can I say? Thank you very much for your affability and your generosity with your time, despite you being a bit under the weather. However, this is the last question. I feel like I have to ask you this, given I'm with one of the preeminent contemporary philosophers. For young people who want to engage with philosophy, both academically and non-academically, unfortunately for me, it seems when people get into philosophy online, they get into like this whole like Jungian, Jordan Peterson, almost like New Age stuff, and they kind of go down that path, which is fine. It's interesting on its own, but I certainly think there's a lot more to philosophy than archetypes. So what advice would you have? Again, a very basic question for people that want to engage with philosophy, and what do you think are currently the important questions for thinkers to struggle with and really struggle with?
I think one of the first things to do is to get a better perspective of human history, because it's important at some point, maybe not in your young career in philosophy, it's important at some point to be able to take Plato and Aristotle very seriously, because these are the two founding giants of our discipline. The problem is that at first glance, they look really old, right? Like, oh, women didn't have rights back then. The Greeks had slaves. Why should we read that stuff, right? It's a long time ago. All right, but philosophy doesn't move at the speed of computer science. Philosophy has maybe a couple of important new ideas per century. I'm sorry to say it, but it does. And a lot of stuff can be found in German, Plato, and Aristotle. So in order to get yourself in a psychological position to be able to read those people seriously, I find it very helpful to look at the length of human history and read about the length of the Stone Age. Go back, read when certain human things were discovered, like the wheel or fire or the domestication of dogs. Get a sense for how old all of that stuff is, the burial of the dead. And then realize that the ancient Greeks are our next door neighbors, comparatively. This is not old stuff. Philosophy is young, it's new. And at the end of the day, if you're not familiar, I'm not saying you should in your 20s because it can kill you, but if by middle age, you're not really at ease with Plato and Aristotle with direct access to the primary texts, you're going to be repeating things that have already been said. You're going to be reinventing the wheel. And so that should be your aim. Not to think that stuff in the last 20 years is necessarily the state of the art. This is another problem with analytic philosophy, by the way. It's overly contemporary in its focus. Continental philosophy is a little better at respecting ancient classics, sometimes too much so. But so that's the first thing I would say. Get a proper perspective on that. Realize that philosophy is not very old, and be able to read from one end of its history to the other. So that's one thing. So maybe reading a good history of philosophy is helpful at an early stage. For me, it was the Julian Marias History of Philosophy, published by Dover in English. And Marias, it's like Maria with an S on the end. He was from Ortega y Gasset's circle, and it's better on pre-20th century. And it's kind of exaggerated maybe in its portrayal of Madrid philosophy, of the school of Madrid in the 20th century, but I think that stuff's better than people realize too. With older stuff, it's quite solid, and he has a real gift for presenting things to young students. And it's been around. It's probably the last time it was edited was in the 60s, so it stood the test of time pretty well. That's my favorite history of philosophy, and it's the one I started with. So that's one I'd recommend. So just read as much good stuff as you can, and not only in philosophy. You try to stay familiar with the basic debates in the sciences. Learn a little Roman history. There's a lot of things you can do to make sure you have some idea of what the basic moments of tension are in human history.
Yes, I would say that's one thing I find akin with yourself and Zizek, even though you both completely philosophically are at odds with each other. You both are such what's the word, eclectic thinkers, where you be aesthetics or archaeology or physics certainly, and now Zizek is really heavily working on quantum physics. So I find that I really do appreciate that in thinkers who kind of have, if I may, the audacity to step into myriad fields. Yeah, great. I mean, thanks for the recommendation. I've never even heard of the book. The only real one I read was by Bertrand Russell and then Will Durant, which were also really good books. But this one seems, if you recommend this seems a bit more extensive.
Yeah, Russell, I think people in the Continental tradition denounce Russell's history too quickly. I think the problem is that he's fairly judgmental and dismissive at times, obviously. Quite a clear person, quite a clear writer and thinker. So that's the virtue in him. I like reading Russell.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the first books I read initially when I kind of got into philosophy as a teenager, really.
And you know what's remarkable is he still sells. Booksellers and publishers will tell you he still sells after all these
Oh
years.
yeah,
He's been dead
yeah.
for half a century.
Yeah, I remember going to a bookstore in Paris a few months ago, and there was just like a whole section, and it was called Bertrand Russell. Like
Wow.
it wasn't even called philosophy, or that, it was called Bertrand Russell, and all of his books, and he's written just prolifically. Again, Professor, thank you very much for your time. I truly I'm grateful for your generosity.
Thank you very much for this podcast.
Excellent.
Very happy with it.